Imagine a city of 3 million people, a cultural jewel. Now imagine that city completely surrounded by enemy forces for nearly 3 years. No food, no heat, temperatures plummeting to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Bodies collapsing in the streets from starvation. Mothers watching their children slowly die. This isn't a scene from a dystopian movie. This is the true story of the siege of Leningrad, the longest and most destructive siege in modern history. A nightmare that claimed more lives than the United States lost in all of World War II. A human tragedy so profound that it would change warfare forever. Today, we're diving deep into 872 days of unimaginable suffering. June 22, 1941, in the early hours of a summer morning, Nazi Germany shattered its non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union and launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. 3.5 million soldiers, 3,600 tanks, 2,700 aircraft, all focused on one goal: crushing the Soviet Union and claiming its vast territories for Hitler's vision of German expansion. Army Group South would strike toward Ukraine's rich agricultural lands, and Army Group North, under the command of Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, had a different prize in mind. Leningrad. Why Leningrad? This wasn't just another Soviet city. This was the birthplace of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. This was the Soviet Union's second-largest city, home to over 600 factories and the entire Baltic Fleet. In Hitler's calculation, if Moscow was the head of the Soviet state, Leningrad was its heart and soul. The German advance was devastating. The Red Army, caught unprepared and poorly led after Stalin's purges of military commanders in the 1930s, crumbled before the German blitzkrieg. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. Towns and cities fell in rapid succession. 3/4 of Leningrad's industrial plants were evacuated eastward, along with hundreds of thousands of workers. But more than 2.5 million people remained workers, children, elderly, refugees who had fled ahead of the German advance, all now trapped in what would become the largest urban death trap in history. The citizens were mobilized to build defenses, trenches, anti-tank ditches, wooden barricades. Barbed wire stretched for miles. They knew their lives depended on it. August 29, 1941. German forces captured the town of Emga, severing Leningrad's last railway connection to the rest of the Soviet Union. 1 week later, on September 8th, they seized Schlüsselburg on the shores of Lake Ladoga, cutting off the last road into the city. The ring had closed. Nearly 3 million soldiers and civilians were now trapped in a city under siege. The only connection to the outside world was Lake Ladoga to the east. In summer, boats could navigate its treacherous waters. In winter, if the ice grew thick enough, vehicles might cross. But for now, in early autumn, the lake was too rough for boats and not yet frozen for vehicles. Leningrad was on its own. Zhukov's preparations were brutal but effective. Every building became a potential fortress, every street a killing zone. The Germans, expecting a quick victory, instead found themselves facing a fortress city defended by soldiers and civilians willing to fight to the death. On September 4th, German artillery began systematically shelling Leningrad. 2 days later, the Luftwaffe's bombers arrived, dropping their deadly payloads on military and civilian targets alike. On September 8th, in one devastating raid, German bombers struck the Batiev warehouses in the southwestern part of the city. The warehouses erupted in flames. Over 5,000 tons of provisions destroyed in a single night. For the millions trapped in the city, this was a catastrophe beyond measure. Those food reserves were supposed to sustain them. Now, with supply lines cut and warehouses burning, when Pavlov arrived and examined the city's remaining food stocks, his face went pale. With the population trapped in the city and no way to bring in supplies, the remaining food would last mere days, perhaps weeks, if strictly rationed. The rationing began immediately. 400 grams for office workers and 300 grams for children and dependents. These rations would be cut again and again as the siege wore on. By November, the situation had become desperate. Bread rations were slashed to their lowest point, just 125 grams per day for most civilians. That's about 2 thin slices. And this wasn't real bread as flour ran out. bakers mixed in sawdust, cellulose, cottonseed cake. People joked grimly that you could use Leningrad bread to repair shoes. What happened next defies imagination. As autumn gave way to the winter of 1941-1942, one of the coldest in decades, Leningrad descended into a frozen hell. Temperatures plummeted to -40 degrees Celsius. The city's heating systems failed. Electricity was sporadic at best. Water pipes froze. People burned anything combustible: furniture, books, floorboards, even precious family heirlooms, desperately trying to stave off the cold that crept through their walls like death itself. And then came the hunger. Not the kind of hunger you feel skipping a meal. This was starvation in its most clinical, horrifying form. The human body, deprived of calories, begins to consume itself. Fat stores disappear first. Then muscle tissue begins to break down. The heart weakens. The immune system collapses. People developed dystrophy, a wasting disease that left them as little more than walking skeletons. By January and February of 1942, the death toll reached its horrifying peak. Over 100,000 people per month were dying in Leningrad. That's more than 3,000 deaths per day. Corpses lay in apartments, frozen solid, sometimes for weeks before discovery. The psychological horror matched the physical suffering. People ate everything imaginable and things beyond imagination. They scraped wallpaper paste from walls because it was made from potatoes. They boiled leather belts and shuasalas to extract any possible nutrition. They made jelly from carpenter's glue. They caught rats, crows, even household pets. And there were darker stories, still stories the Soviet authorities tried desperately to suppress. Over 2,000 people were arrested for cannibalism during the siege. In a city where death was everywhere and survival meant everything, some people crossed the last moral boundary. But while Leningrad suffered through its darkest winter, salvation was being engineered across the frozen surface of Lake Ladoga. The idea was audacious: build a supply route across a frozen lake that was known for unstable ice, unpredictable weather, and fierce storms. Soviet engineers and scientists worked frantically to calculate ice thickness, optimal routes, and safe weight loads. At -10, the same thickness would form in just 34 hours. They needed the ice to be at least 20 centimeters thick, about 8 inches, to support loaded trucks. 60 horse-drawn sledges, carrying supplies, set out from the eastern shore, bound for Osinovets on Leningrad's side of the lake. It was a 30-kilometer journey across groaning, cracking ice, and thus began the operation that would come to be known as the Road of Life, Doroga Zhizny in Russian. The Road of Life was a miracle of desperate engineering. Trucks were specially loaded to distribute weight. Drivers kept their windows open and doors unlocked, ready to jump clear if the ice broke beneath them. They drove at night to avoid German bombers, their headlights off, navigating by landmarks and instinct. The road was marked with pine branches stuck in the ice every kilometer. The ice didn't always hold. Trucks regularly broke through and sank to the bottom of the lake, taking their drivers and precious cargo with them. German artillery constantly shelled the route. Luftwaffe fighters strafed the convoys. But the trucks kept moving. The drivers kept driving. In November 1941, the route delivered 1,500 tons of food to the starving city. With the route fully operational and a railway spur completed on the eastern shore, that number had jumped to over 250,000 tons. Along with food came military supplies, ammunition, fuel, weapons. Over 32,000 tons of military equipment and 37,000 tons of fuel crossed the ice. During that first winter of 1941-1942, over the entire siege, 1.3 million people would be brought to safety across those frozen waters. Soviet ingenuity didn't stop with trucks on ice. In May and June of 1942, engineers laid an 8-mile pipeline across the bottom of Lake Ladoga, running at a depth of 12 meters. This artery of life delivered 295 tons of fuel per day to Leningrad. Later, they laid electrical cables across the lake bed, connecting the city to the power station at Volkhov. While the Road of Life brought relief, conditions inside Leningrad remained apocalyptic throughout 1942 and into 1943. This wasn't just a military siege. Hitler had explicitly ordered that Leningrad be wiped from the face of the earth. The strategy was deliberate starvation combined with systematic destruction. German artillery surrounded the city at a distance, including massive 420mm railway guns, the largest siege weapons in Europe. Day after day, shells rained down on the city, systematically reducing it to rubble. The Luftwaffe continued its bombing campaigns. Yet amid this horror, acts of extraordinary humanity and defiance emerged. As people starved around him, Ivanov guarded rice samples in the collection. Instead, he starved to death at his post, protecting seeds that might one day feed future generations. Several of his colleagues did the same, dying of hunger while surrounded by edible plants they refused to consume. There was Tanya Savacheva, a 12-year-old girl who kept a diary of her family's deaths. In stark, heartbreaking entries, she recorded the death of each family member. Zhenya died on December 28 at 12 p.m. 1941. Granny died on January 25, 3 p.m. 1942. Mama on May 13 at 7:30 a.m. 1942. The Savachevs are dead. Everyone is dead. Only Tanya is left. Tanya herself was evacuated but died in 1944 from intestinal tuberculosis, her body too damaged by starvation to recover. Her diary became one of the most powerful symbols of the siege's human cost, where he composed the first three movements of his Seventh Symphony. The symphony was a defiant act of culture in the face of barbarity. On August 9, 1942, in the besieged city, a depleted, starving orchestra performed the complete symphony for a packed hall of starving people. The performance was broadcast over loudspeakers throughout the city and directed toward German lines as an act of cultural resistance. It told the Germans, "You may surround us, you may starve us, but you cannot kill our spirit." As 1942 turned into 1943, the strategic situation began to shift. The German army, stretched thin across multiple fronts and reeling from the disaster at Stalingrad, Soviet forces, better equipped and battle-hardened, began planning major offensives. On January 12, 1943, the Red Army launched Operation Iskra Operation Spark. Forces from the Leningrad Front and the Volkhov Front attacked German positions south of Lake Ladoga, fighting to create a land corridor to the city. After 7 days of brutal combat, on January 18th, the two Soviet armies met. They had punched through the German encirclement. The breakthrough was narrow, just 8 to 11 kilometers wide, but it was enough. Engineers immediately began constructing a railway line through the corridor. This new supply route, called the Road of Victory, supplemented the Road of Life. Supplies could now reach Leningrad by land as well as across the ice. But the siege wasn't over. The Germans still surrounded much of the city. Artillery still pounded Leningrad. Bombing raids continued. The narrow corridor was under constant enemy fire. For another year, Leningrad remained partially besieged, its people still suffering, still dying. Finally, in January 1944, the Red Army launched a massive offensive. Soviet forces now vastly outnumbered the Germans in the Leningrad region 2-1 in troops, 4-1 in tanks and aircraft. The weakened German Army Group North, drained by years of attrition and the withdrawal of its best units to other fronts, could no longer hold. Despite Hitler's explicit orders to hold their positions, German commanders recognized the futility. On January 27, 1944, the German army withdrew. After 872 days, nearly 2.5 years, the siege of Leningrad was officially over. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. By the end of the siege, Leningrad's population had been reduced from over 3 million to just 700,000. Of those 700,000, approximately 300,000 were soldiers who had come from other parts of the Soviet Union to defend the city. Only 400,000 of the city's original inhabitants survived. The death toll remains disputed to this day. The Soviet government officially reported 670,000 deaths during the siege, with the majority attributed to starvation. Most modern historians estimate the true number was between 1.1 and 1.5 million. Some estimates go as high as 2 million. To put this in perspective, the siege of a single city killed more people than the United States lost in all of World War II, more than the Holocaust killed at Auschwitz. More than died in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. 500,000 victims were buried at Piskarevskoye Cemetery in mass graves that stretch as far as the eye can see. The physical city was devastated, thousands of buildings destroyed, infrastructure ruined, an entire generation traumatized. The city wouldn't regain its pre-war population until the 1960s. In the immediate aftermath, the siege became a powerful symbol of Soviet resistance and sacrifice. Stalin awarded Leningrad the Order of Lenin in 1945. In 1965, the city became the first to receive the honorary title Hero City of the Soviet Union. But for years, the full truth of the siege was suppressed. Soviet censorship ensured that the most horrific details, the cannibalism, the incompetence of some local officials, the privilege enjoyed by party elites while common people starved, remained hidden from public view. A museum dedicated to the siege was gradually shut down under Stalin, not reopening until 1989. The authorities feared that honest discussion of the siege might raise uncomfortable questions about Soviet leadership, about why the city wasn't evacuated earlier, about how food distribution was managed, about whether the suffering could have been prevented or reduced. It wasn't until the 1960s, during Khrushchev's thaw, that public commemoration resumed. Mass graves were reorganized. Monuments were erected. The 900-day siege became central to Leningrad's, later St. Petersburg's, identity. Today, monuments dot the former siege lines. The Road of Life has become a UNESCO World Heritage Site, with markers every kilometer along its route. The Flower of Life memorial commemorates the children who suffered and died, with stone slabs inscribed with excerpts from Tanya Savichova's diary. The Broken Ring monument stands on the shore of Lake Ladoga, a massive sculpture of two concrete arcs reaching toward each other across the gap, symbolizing the broken siege ring. In recent decades, historians have begun asking a deeply uncomfortable question. Was the siege of Leningrad a genocide? The legal definition of genocide requires intent to destroy a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Hitler's explicit orders were to wipe Leningrad from the face of the earth. German military documents show a deliberate strategy of starvation. Occupying the city was explicitly ruled out because it would make the Germans responsible for food supply. The resolution was clear: lay siege, bombard, and starve the population. At the Nuremberg trials after the war, judges ruled that the siege was not criminal, stating that cutting off sustenance from a besieged city was deemed legitimate under the laws of war as they existed at the time. Even killing civilians fleeing the siege was ruled legal. But laws have evolved. The use of starvation as a weapon of war is now a war crime under international law change, influenced in part by the horror of Leningrad. Some modern historians, including Timo Vavenen and Nikita Lomagin, now classify the siege as genocide, arguing that the deliberate starvation of a city's civilian population, with full knowledge that millions would die, constitutes an attempt to destroy the city and its people. The siege of Leningrad stands as one of history's darkest chapters, a testament to both the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human endurance. It showed us that modern warfare could create suffering on a scale previously unimaginable. An entire city turned into a concentration camp. Its people slowly starved while the world watched. It demonstrated how civilian populations could be deliberately targeted as a military strategy, a precedent that would echo through conflicts from Dresden to Hiroshima to countless wars since. But it also showed us something else: the incredible resilience of the human spirit. In Leningrad, people didn't just survive, they resisted. They worked in factories producing weapons even as they starved. They performed symphonies while bombs fell. They taught classes, published newspapers, maintained libraries, protected cultural treasures. They refused to let their humanity be destroyed even as their bodies failed. The drivers on the Road of Life risked death every night to bring food to strangers. Scientists starved to death protecting seeds. Mothers gave their rations to their children. Ordinary people performed extraordinary acts of courage and compassion in a city where death was the only certainty. Today, in St. Petersburg, as Leningrad is now called, elderly survivors gather each year on January 27th to remember. Their numbers dwindle with each passing year. Soon, there will be no one left who remembers the taste of 125 grams of bread, the cold of that first winter, the silence of empty streets, the weight of loss. But their story must not be forgotten. It must be told and retold because it teaches us essential truths about war's true cost, about the value of human life, about the strength found in solidarity and shared suffering, about the dangers of dehumanizing enemies, about the resilience of cities and the people who refuse to abandon them. The siege of Leningrad was 872 days of hell, but it was also 872 days of resistance. 872 days of survival against impossible odds. 872 days that proved that the human spirit, even when pushed to its absolute limit, can endure. And that is a lesson worth remembering. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe. Share it with someone who should know this history. And in the comments, tell us, what aspect of the siege of Leningrad affected you most? What lessons do you think we should carry forward from this tragedy? Remember the million who died. Honor the courage of those who survived. And never forget that the horrors of Leningrad were perpetrated by human beings against other human beings, which means we have a responsibility to ensure such suffering never happens again. Thank you for watching.